Thank you everyone for joining us also today. I'll introduce this last session of this series. We are at the TRC Sunkhronos Institute lab. You are here because maybe you followed our previous sessions of exploring rhythm analysis as a method. This series is co-facilitated and devised with colleagues Michelle Lefebvre-Jones and Fede Dacca, and with the help of Monica Schab at the technical support. Today it is the last of this series. We are very happy to introduce Fraya Frehse. I will say a few words about her and the title of her presentation. Fraya Frehse is connecting from far, far away, Brazil. She's Associate Professor of Sociology of the City, of Space and Everyday Life at the University of São Paulo. She has recently finished the British Academy Visiting Fellowship stay at Cambridge Centre of Latin American Studies. And at the University of São Paulo, she coordinates a Center for Studies and Research on the Sociology of Space and Time, and acts as both lead partner and action speaker of the Global Center of Spatial Methods for Urban Sustainability, which is based at the Technische Universität, I hope I pronounced this right, in Berlin, and funded by the German Academic Exchange Service. She's also a member of the Global Cities program of the University of São Paulo Institute of Advanced Studies. A few more information about Fraya. She's an alumna of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and a life member of Clare Hall College, University of Cambridge. She has held visiting fellowships in different places, 3 Berlin universities alongside Paris Diderot, Vienna and Cambridge, and professorships at the Universidad Nacional de Cuyo, Argentina, Freie Universität Berlin, Germany, and at the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee, again, I hope it's right, India. So she has a very wide and worldwide experience. Her research, and this is why she's here with us today, addresses the relationship between body, public space and urbanization, social inequality, homelessness and public space, intersectionality and space, space and time in sociology, public space and urban sustainability. So she has extensive publications, both in Brazilian and internationally journal, reflecting particularly today on Henri Lefebvre's methodological approach to the historicity of urbanization, in particular on what she's presenting today, regressive-progressive method of analysis, rhythm analysis. So among other publications, we will just mention 2 monographic books in Portuguese. One is Hey You in the Street, The Passerby and the Onset of Modernity in São Paulo, and The Times of the Street in São Paulo during the late Empire. Today, she will present to us like an introduction titled Entangling Historical and Daily Temporalities, Regressive-Progressive Rhythmanalysis. So thank you, Fraya, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gaia, for the presentation, and also thank you all for the opportunity and the exchange. It has been a wonderful time here to meet you during the last 2 months. This research symposium series has made well evident that the rhythm analysis focuses on the analytical differentiation of the sequential repetitions that permeate and envelop the human body in everyday life. To sum up, the rhythm analysis helps us analytically identify what I heuristically term here daily temporalities of human beings, body and flesh, to quote Lefebvre in the first chapter of the French original publication Éléments de Rhythmanalyse, Elements of Rhythm Analysis, as far as I translated freely, body and flesh. What in my view remains less evident in this research seminar and also throughout the scholarship regarding the rhythm analysis is the connection between these daily temporalities and what I term historical temporalities in Lefebvre's rhythmanalysis. By referring to historical temporalities, I mean temporal categories that Western common sense names present, past, and future, but regarding in particular societal changes, that is, social transformations. Based on my previously mentioned work, or the work I've done on regressive progressive rhythm analysis, which Monica is going to share with you, hopefully, yes, actually work on the links between Lefebvre's regressive progressive method and rhythm analysis. What I here aim to do is to address the following issue. So let me try to see whether the issue is, what is the contribution of the relationship between daily and historical temporalities in Lefebvre's rhythm analysis for us as current rhythm analysts? My statement is twofold and actually of a methodological nature. The contribution of the bonds between the daily and historical temporalities for present-day rhythm analysts is actually of a methodological nature, and as we will see, I would argue for a threefold contribution that rhythm analysis, considering these entanglements between what I call daily and historical temporalities, may offer to us. In order to develop this statement, my presentation will be structured in actually in 4 steps. First, I'm going to address precisely this relationship between what I call daily and historical temporalities in Lefebvre's rhythm analysis, and also in his overall work, and then subsequently, I'm going to tackle this issue methodologically in regressive progressive terms. And then I'm going to show, as it were, this approach, this methodological approach in action amidst São Paulo's pedestrians. And then I hope that this threefold methodological contribution of regressive progressive rhythm analysis, what I term regressive progressive rhythm analysis, may come to the fore. So the first step to address this issue of the relationship between these temporalities implies first and foremost to recall that Lefebvre starts to deploy the rhythm analysis as such more than 30 years before the publication of the so-called rhythm analytical project, altogether with Catherine Régulier in 1985. That is 4 years after their marriage, which lasted until Lefebvre's death in 1991. The second volume of the Critique of Everyday Life, Critique la vie quotidienne, from 1961, contains an allusion to the sociological rhythmology or rhythm analysis, I quote, followed by a footnote with the following indication. Term borrowed from Gaston Bachelard, the latter, Gaston Bachelard, in turn, in Dialectique de la Durée from 1950, wrote that he himself borrowed the concept from the Portuguese philosopher Lúcio Alberto Pinheiro dos Santos. Lúcio Alberto Pinheiro dos Santos, for whom, according to the German scholar Kurt Meyer, the analysis of physiological rhythms could cure mental depression or apathy. After this first citation in Lefebvre's work, the term rhythm analysis reappears at least in La Production de l'Espace from 1974, in La Présence et l'Absence, the presence and the absence from 1980, and in the third volume of the Critique of Everyday Life from 1981. These references show that the rhythm analysis is strongly embedded in Lefebvre's more comprehensive work, and in particular in his Critique of Everyday Life project, which started in the 1940s. Let me briefly recall that the first volume of the critique stems from 1947 and was republished in 1958 with a groundbreaking preface to the second edition, while the second volume went out in 1961 and the third one in 1981, which was precisely the year in which Lefebvre married Régulier. Indeed, according to Lefebvre's friend Armand Agimbert, Lefebvre himself considered Elements of Rhythm Analysis the fourth volume of his Critique of Everyday Life. Hence, it becomes clear why the rhythms of everyday life as such abound in Lefebvre's posthumous monographic treatise on rhythm analysis. In Elements of Rhythm Analysis, rhythms are conceived as being made up of the dialectical relations between cyclical repetitions stemming from, I quote, the cosmic nature, days, nights, seasons, oceanic waves and tides, monthly cycles, etc., end of quote, and linear repetitions deriving from, and I quote, social practice, thus from human activity, the monotony of actions and gestures, imposed frameworks, end of quote, which in reality, as Lefebvre explicitly emphasizes, constantly interfere with one another, but which analysis would dissociate. Indeed, the referential reality is everyday life, which Lefebvre, long before that, precisely in the first volume of the Critique of Everyday Life, defined as, I quote, a level of social reality. But which kind of level? It is, I quote, simultaneously the most visible and indiscernible side of social practice, where banality and depth coexist, for it is about existence and the lived, not speculatively transcribed, within a dialectics between cyclic and rhythmal and linear times, which make up everyday life. Against this backdrop, we may be at first sight led to conceive rhythm analysis as an analytical approach exclusively focused on the now and then of everyday rhythms regarding cyclical and linear repetitions. In fact, regarding the empirical inquiry of rhythms, Lefebvre and Régulier suggest the coexistence of two complementary methodological paths: a comparison between concrete cases concerning either body rhythms of living beings and or otherwise, or stemming from notions from abstract categories. The aim of both procedures was made explicit by both authors in the Rhythm Analytical Project. I quote, "We will demonstrate the relations between everyday life and rhythms, that is, the concrete modalities of social life," end of quote. But things are much more complex in the rhythm analysis. This is my argument here. No? Therefore, we have to take into consideration as a starting point that temporalities regarding the past, the present, and the future, implicit in social transformations and social processes, to sum up what I termed historical temporalities, also appear in the aforementioned first chapter of the Elements of Rhythm Analysis. But these historical temporalities are named differently. Historical times. They are conceived as, I quote, contradictory possibilities implicit in social time. And now I quote, "Historical times slow down or speed up, advance or regress, prospect or retrospect. By following which criteria? According to political representations and decisions, but also according to the historian's perspective. Objectively speaking, for change to occur, a social group, a class, or a community has to intervene and set the rhythm for an era, either by force or by insinuation. And hence, we finally arrive at the relevance of the relationship between daily and historical temporalities in Lefebvre's overall work. Since at least the 1940s, Lefebvre's oeuvre is theoretically concerned with the identification of possibilities of future social change contained in varied, empirically given research locations of the present and the past. For a summary, you can have a look at the second volume of the Critique of Everyday Life. This is the reason why Lefebvre regularly deployed one and the same epistemological standpoint of a dialectical, meta-philosophical nature in all his work prior to the rhythmanalysis. This is transduction. Transduction should not be confounded neither with deduction nor with induction. In the French original of The Ride to the City, Lefebvre didactically defines transduction as an intellectual operation that can be pursued methodically and that differs from induction, from classical deduction, and also from the construction of models, from simulation, from the simple statement of hypothesis. Transduction elaborates and constructs a theoretical object, a possible object, and this on the basis of information about reality and a problem posed by that reality. Transduction involves constant feedback between the conceptual framework used and empirical observations. Its theory methodology shapes certain operations of the urban designer, of the architect, of the sociologist, of the politician, of the philosopher. Transduction introduces rigor into invention and knowledge into utopia. End of quote. To sum up, with the aid of Lefebvre's second volume of Critique of Everyday Life, transduction, I quote, goes from the given real to the possible. This epistemological stance is inseparable from one specific research object of an empirical nature, which Lefebvre addressed throughout the decades by reframing Marx's dialectics regarding the notion of praxis. Lefebvre's research emphasis on social practice, which in the production of space becomes spatial practice, stems from praxis conceived as, I quote, acts dialectical relation between nature and human beings in everyday life. I quote from The Sociology of Marx. Hence, praxis concerns one and the same act in everyday life, bearing in itself a three-dimensional historical possibility, the possibility of being repetitive, of being mimetic, of previous models, or of being inventive of discontinuities in, I quote, the global social historical process. From, again, the Sociology of Marx. Indeed, we should not forget that Lefebvre's major ideological reference is Karl Marx's central statement of the humanization of mankind, or the human species, as he states in his The Return of Dialectics from 1986. The humanization of mankind as a historical process mediated by the mismatches, alienation, temporally underpinning the relations that human beings nurture with their work, which Marx equaled to praxis. I'm actually talking about Marx. Yes, for Marx, it's like this. It's a historical process mediated by the mismatches and alienation and so on. No? And but Lefebvre, he has this in mind, yes, and he has this humanism. That's why he has also been named a kind of romantic utopian and so on, because he has this really this hope in humankind, in the process, in the historical process of the humanization of mankind, which is obviously a dialectical process and is obviously that it's not a philosophy of history like it was in such as that was with Marx, but it is as we will see, it's a methodological. He has an ideological engagement with this mindset, as it were, with this idea. But in Lefebvre's oeuvre, this concept of the humanization of mankind and alienation as a mediation of this process, yes, this plays an important methodological role in his work. All of this takes place within actually the sociological recovery of Marx's dialectical method in search of its interpretive potential concerning post-war capitalism. Therefore, Lefebvre's early sociological works pursue the possibilities of social transformation contained in everyday life, in the so-called modern world, according to historically embedded contradictions of this level of social reality that is most evident and simultaneously most indiscernible to the observer. To put it briefly, for the purposes of this lecture, the here and then of everyday life is a historical product. To be sure, it is dialectically undergirded on the one hand by the historical possibility of the everyday, le quotidien in the original French formulation. This is a way of life historically typical of society whose day-to-day existence with the advent of Western modernity became engulfed by the contradictions of programming and calculation steered by the market, the system of equivalences, and marketing and advertising. On the other hand, and as an extreme dialectical moment, everyday life comprises the historical possibility of the also contradictory everydayness, la quotidienneté, a notion that underlies the homogeneous, repetitive, fragmentary dimension of everyday life. Indeed, the preface of the first revised volume of the Critique of Everyday Life explicitly mentions the existence of a critical program founded on the critique of alienation in capitalism in the second post-war period. In theoretical terms, it was about updating Marxian postulations on the subject in order to understand the social reality of the second half of the 20th century. In light of this decade-long intellectual project, the rhythm analysis of everyday life proposed in Elements of Rhythm Analysis cannot do without analytically addressing the relationship between historical and daily temporalities implicit in everyday life. The critical potential of a Lefebvrean rhythm analysis resides precisely in tackling this relationship methodologically. Now, the weird aspect, both in Lefebvre's Elements of Rhythm Analysis and the two texts on the issue he co-authored with Regressive-Progressive, that is, the Rhythm Analytical Project and Rhythm Analysis of the Mediterranean Cities, is that they all lack explicit methodological references to this issue. In fact, the basic methodological procedures to empirically assess the rhythms that pervade everyday life, comprise, I quote, isolating from the organized whole a particular movement and its rhythm. A procedure which, in turn, demands from the rhythm analyst a definite, defined attitude to make one's body onto a metronome, hence a special kind of parameter for listening to the bodies of others in search of the mutual integration of the outside and the inside of these same bodies. Indeed, the experience and knowledge of the body here and now are the foundations of rhythm analysis, as summarized in the conclusion of Elements of Rhythm Analysis. If we take into consideration that in the book, these methodological suggestions go hand in hand with the author's empirical focus on research objects which involved their own everyday, day-to-day in the late 20th century Europe, one Parisian street, the trading of bodies, media, music, Mediterranean cities, it becomes evident why current rhythm analytical scholarship does not focus on the issue at stake here at all, the relationship between daily and historical temporalities in rhythm analysis. In my view, the issue, however, remains crucial for at least two reasons. Firstly, it's decisive if we intend to properly develop a Lefebvrean rhythm analytical critique of everyday life. This means potentially exploring all the methodological implications implicit in Lefebvre's transductive standpoint regarding the historical possibilities of social transformation in the present-day world. This said, there's more at stake than just a Lefebvrean critique. And here I approach my statement regarding the methodological contribution of the relationship between daily and historical temporalities for us as rhythm analysts, as it were. For this point to become clear, let me now address one only tacit element in Lefebvre's rhythm analytical project, the regressive-progressive method. And now I come to the, sorry, let me see. What's happening here? Yeah, okay, sorry. Yes. Now I come to the second point here. Lefebvre's overall work conveys a constant commitment to operationalize, methodologically speaking, his transductive way of thinking. The major outcome in this sense is the regressive-progressive method, which he first presented in the article named Perspectives of Rural Sociology from 1953, and whose procedure Lefebvre since then adopted for several empirical fields, I quote, of research, ranging from rural villages such as Canton and capital cities such as Paris, to the field of representation in the framework of his theory of representations published in 1980, named, The Presence and the Absence, as well as to the right of the city in 1967 and the production of space in 1974. Both facets of this method, the investigative and the interpretive, are found in three dialectical procedures or moments. So what I'm arguing is that Lefebvre, as a philosopher, developed his transduction and also this epistemological standpoint linked to his meta-philosophical way of addressing social life and particularly everyday life. But he became a sociologist in the meantime, yes, or in the 1940s, from the 1940s on. And then he very intensely gets engaged in trying to operationalize, as it were. This is my argument, transduction, yes? And the regressive-progressive method is the outcome of this. And I will not, if I don't take care, I will only talk about the regressive-progressive methods, because this is something I work on a lot, but I will, that's why I will stick to the text here in order not to divert too much. But the idea is that it's a method based on 3 steps. No? With the aid of participant observation and interviews, surveys and statistics, the researcher first describes, in the so-called descriptive moment of the method, the empirically given field, or more precisely, what an analyst termed social life or social relations and the elements of material and spiritual culture. Then, based on this description, which is actually an ethnographic description of the field, there follows the so-called analytical regressive moment, which involves the attempt to identify the exact dates of the previously described reality. These exact dates are historical dates, as he says, or the ages of the relations that have been described earlier. Then a third historical genetic moment enters the scene. The transformations, I quote, of each of the previously dated structures are, I quote, elucidated and understood against the background of the further internal or external development and of these structures' subordination to the overall structures, to the overall process, end of quote. The effort, I quote, is to return to the previously described actual in order to meet the present again, but this time an explained present. I quote, and emphasis in explained. As I summarized elsewhere, the coexistence of things, of social relations and representations of different ages in the actual, of society, of the individual, discloses contradictions between the research field elements that historically changed and those that did not, from the methodological viewpoint of other already accomplished historical possibilities of transformation, social transformation, embedded in the contradictory overall process, end of quote. Against this backdrop, rhythm analysis appears as knowledge about the rhythms of everyday life that are based on, knowledge about the rhythms of everyday life that is based on a well-defined type of analysis of such an object. But Lefebvre, however, never explicitly stated this knowledge and this way of analyzing rhythms as such. Given that cyclical and linear rhythms are so fundamental to the critique of everyday life, Lefebvre often dated them historically for analytical purposes. Cyclical repetitions prevail in the pre-capitalist world, whereas the analysis of the abstract, quantitative time of the capitalist clock emphasizes linear repetitions. That is, although both coexist in mutual interference within the contradictory and open totality that is empirical reality. It is precisely due to this standpoint that I argue that rhythm analysis is invariably regressive-progressive. It presumes in operational terms the regressive-progressive method. While Lefebvre never made this connection explicit, he did make operational use of it at various points in his oeuvre. The first reference to rhythm analysis happens in the context of the reflection on the interaction between times and spaces and the historically specific way of life that is everyday life. The approach, I quote, strives to categorize periodicities and study their relationships and interactions. This is 1961, the second volume of Critique of Everyday Life. In turn, in 1968, an indirect reference to the connection between rhythm analysis and the regressive-progressive method appears in everyday life in the modern world. The critique of everyday life, I quote, should demonstrate, now I quote, again, historically the constitution and formation of the everydayness, among others, the separation of man-nature, the displacement of rhythms, the rise of nostalgia, the deterioration of drama, or rather of the tragic and temporality, end of quote. A decisive element in the possibility of a critique of everyday life seems to be, among others, that rhythms hold clues of their underlying historical processes. Rhythm analysis is explicitly mentioned once again in 1964, when the investigative gaze turns to the production of space as a central historical process of modernity, and again in connection with the apprehension of historical transformations. He says, in and through I quote, in and through the space that is the human body itself in everyday life, considering that for Lefebvre, both every living body is a space and has its space, and that social relations only have a real existence in and through space. Moreover, since, I quote, social time is produced and reproduced through space, but this social time is reintroduced with its traits and determinations, repetitions, rhythms, cycles, activities, then, I quote, the scientific knowledge about the use of spaces, end of quote, is invariably linked to the analysis of rhythms, the effective critique of the representative and the normative spaces. In effect, rhythm analysis, I quote, completes the exhibition, l'exposé, of the production of space. In 1980, another research object gained prominence, the non-philosophical representations that emerge in everyday life. Rhythm analysis can also be useful for grasping the presence of the absent. Cyclical rhythms lie beneath the qualitative use of the body and therefore presence. Linear rhythms, in turn, only imprint a feeling of absence that invades the everyday. And so, in the third volume of the Critique of la vie quotidienne, or everyday life, the approach is acknowledged for the first time as a new science in the making. However, the author's connection with the critique of everyday life as a historical process remains. And now I quote from the third volume: from the organization of work, divided and composed, measured and quantified, quantification wants society as a whole, contributing to the implementation of the mode of production. The qualitative has almost disappeared. But here, once again, the almost gains chief importance. So we see again that there is always this importance of the historical within the rhythmic. No? Lefebvre recognized the specific dynamics of rhythms as a trait of contemporary society. I quote, "The crushing of rhythms and natural times by linearity is," I quote, "a situation that engenders a need for rhythms expressed in the rhythmic innovations found in music and dance." All of this happened 4 years before the first article entirely devoted to the rhythmanalytical project. If, in such a context, the theoretical foundations of the methodological procedures of rhythm analysis gain importance, the argumentative structure of all these works continues to associate certain historical transformations of capitalist society in the cities with rhythms. I hope this research trajectory makes evident that rhythm analysis favors the empirical apprehension as to how the possibilities of social transformation appear also in the everyday life of diversified present-day locations. The requirement is that the rhythm analyst explores the regressive-progressive dimension of rhythm analysis. But how exactly, in practical terms, should regressive-progressive rhythm analysis be mobilized? For heuristic purposes, let me briefly synthesize the case study I dwelled upon in my referential paper on the approach. So what did the body rhythms of São Paulo's pedestrians during the 2010s disclose about the historical temporalities implicit in the urbanization process? And now this is what I'm going to address now. By understanding, now I'm really trying a Lefebvrean analysis of urbanization, global urbanization, based on the body rhythms of São Paulo's pedestrians, yes? By understanding urbanization in Lefebvrean terms, that is, as a set of contradictory processes that encompass the economic, social, and cultural dimensions of the geographical expansion of cities, this is a quote from footnote, but the reference is the urban revolution. I here recall the following research question based on documentary and ethnographic data from two former research projects of mine. Which different characteristics regarding contemporary urbanization come to the forefront when, as a regressive-progressive rhythm analytical researcher, my own body becomes a metronome in the public places of the historical birthplace of the largest Latin American megacity with over 12 million inhabitants. And this downtown area is also the heart of a metropolitan region which is home to over 20 million inhabitants. I here refer to Lefebvre's stance of making the researcher's own body the decisive parameter for apprehending the rhythms of other bodies in favor of a reciprocal integration of the outside and the inside. Only in this case, in pursuit of differences that become evident in São Paulo's urbanization process when one relates it with contemporary urbanization as an ongoing historical process all over the globe, and which I understand as an open and contradictory totality, which is actually Lefebvre's concept of totality, philosophical concept of totality. It is precisely the anthropological and historical defamiliarization of the daily temporalities in the research spaces brought about by the regressive-progressive rhythm analytical approach that is inspiring to me. So precisely what I call this anthropological and historical defamiliarization. What does this mean? This means the ethnographic dialectics implicit in the epistemological process of making spatially and temporally strange what is familiar, and familiar what is spatially and temporally strange for the researcher, but in bodily terms, during all the phases of empirical research. Here, I instantaneously was encouraged to historically defamiliarize my own body rhythms in the 21st century São Paulo public places. To this end, I could rely on documentary data from a former ethnographic study of mine on the onset of the 19th century Western European modernity in a city, São Paulo, that until the mid-19th century was still grounded on slavery. It was still intensely rural and home to circa 30,000 inhabitants, including the rural zone. The regressive-progressive rhythm analysis of the body rhythms of pedestrians in the streets and squares of São Paulo's oldest urbanized nucleus between the early 19th century and the early 20th century, vis-a-vis my own 21st century movements in the 21st century city, ethnographic movements, led me to find out that the passerby, which is an urban type we all know very well because we all are passers-by when we step onto the streets and squares, that the passerby is a very specific temporal and spatial social cultural invention. Besides being the essence of the modern urbanite, its own variations commonplace for Western Europe, including being the dandy or the flaneur, etc. The passerby is also the type of pedestrian which I personally identify with in bodily terms in the streets and squares of any city. The passerby complies with a very particular way of using one's body through gestures and postures. One physically passes by the streets and squares, whereas a stop just happens in a fleeting way, as a more or less quick pause before or after the next or the last body behavior of passing by. But the decisive moment for the characterization of the passerby is that this body technique, in accordance with the anthropologist Marcel Mauss' concept of body techniques, takes place in a defined regular rhythm, linear in nature and corresponding to the rhythms of work and leisure of the passerby. Thus, in rhythm analytical terms, what particularizes the passerby is the regular physical passing by the urban streets and squares. From a regressive-progressive standpoint, this body behavior is inseparable from the 19th century modernity in Western Europe, that is from, in Lefebvrean terms, a social and cultural reality strongly grounded on the simultaneous belief and critique that everything and everyone is transient, fashionable, and modern. The regular physical passing by or circulation through São Paulo's central streets and squares started to establish itself as a norm of civility with an increasing empirical scope from the 1980s on, with a final crisis of African slavery in the country. African slavery was officially abolished in 1888. Hence, the circulation's protagonist, the passerby, even became a photographic subject within this context. We might just consider that the human shapes fleetingly passing by both the left sidewalk and the street right hand in the lower half of the following photograph. So we have here a start, as it were, an evidence of this historical start of the historical possibility of having passers-by in São Paulo. I will here only illustrate the argument with street photographs, but you have to imagine that I made a crisscross analysis of newspapers and also of accounts, travel logs, and so on and so on. And then in Paris, the flaneur emerged in the mid 19th century as an urban literary type, and in São Paulo, whether you believe it or not, the literary and also journalistic type that appeared was the passerby, o transeunte. It appears it signs up articles saying, look, let's now I want now so this, and in attention with the streets being occupied by slaves, enslaved people in this case. Now we see nowadays. So lots of enslaved people in the streets, and the passerby making evident a conflict regarding modern life. What is the city? We want a modern city, and how is it possible that we have so many enslaved people here selling things on streets and so on and so on. Until then, indeed, the streets and the squares of downtown São Paulo had been essentially places for the regular physical permanence and, depending on the occasion, the gathering of certain types of pedestrians, especially people who, involved in the work and sociability of manual labor, were often captured by the heavy photographic cameras of the era while standing, or sitting, or even lying in front of some door sill, perhaps in front of one of the various artisans' workshops that coexisted in that area of the still slavery-based city. I refer here to men, women, and children who were either enslaved, manumitted, or poor freemen. In turn, among the members of the seigneurial stratum, holding great social prestige in the city at that time, there were other implicit rhythms within the set of body techniques in the streets of São Paulo. The exceptional or periodic physical passing by or gathering of men, women, and children of the elite within the context of several ceremonial occasions, for example, kinds of civic festivities in front of the government's palace and so on. What I would like what differently from that, when strolling with the aid of participant observation along the same streets and squares during the afternoon business hours from 2 to 7 during the work days of the 2010s, so more 100 years later, what surprised me was not so much the large amount of passers-by, which are typical of the 20th century urbanization in São Paulo, but the presence. What caught my attention the most was the multiplicity of what I have been terming non-passers-by. These were the ones who challenged me conceptually as to different traits of the present-day urbanization, given that the sociological literature on contemporary Western metropolises commonly characterizes streets as spaces of mobility and of the hastened flow of pedestrians and vehicles. So what we find in these streets here of São Paulo is an immense amount of people who don't pass by amidst the frenetic traffic of passers-by, and also obviously of automobiles and so on, cars and so on. Whether artists or artisans, street vendors or street preachers, as well as self-appointed street dwellers, retired or unemployed people of varying ages and genders, in the midst of the transit either of passers-by, whether fleetingly rushing or pausing, natives or foreigners, of vehicles and of public transportation, these pedestrians of varied economic, socioeconomic, social cultural, and social spatial backgrounds unknowingly shared a defined set of body techniques and body rhythms. They remained there physically in linear regularity, while whether for the purpose of economic survival or for the sake of social bonds therein, which reactivated from day to day. At 7 o'clock, when the stores closed their doors and the public hostels have already opened theirs, not just these passers-by, but also the plethora of non-passers-by disappear from the São Paulo downtown streets and public squares. Only those who, out of necessity or desire to sleep there, remain there physically and regularly on the streets and alleyways at night. They stay there on a regular basis. When, in light of this empirical scenario, the analytical focus falls on the rules of social interactions that make historically possible the production and reproduction of this street society in São Paulo's most urbanized perimeter during the working day business hours, I was able to recognize that cyclical repetitions condition the day-to-day linear rhythms of regular physical permanence in that space. Fatigue transforms the squares and sidewalks into a bench, a wall, or a public sculpture, or public sculpture becomes a bed. Moreover, in an attempt to cope with the growing hunger, there is nothing like the necessary ingredients gathered via buying or begging and a small campfire on the same wall. The nearby cops do not seem to bother. In short, what Lefebvre considers a bodily, qualitative use of space conditioned by cyclical rhythms is true in such public places urbanistically conceived for the linear body rhythms of the passerby during business hours. All of this took and still takes place amid the incisiveness of linear body rhythms of people passing by and of stopping pedestrians of native or foreign origin right there and then. These empirical data reinforce the impression that, at least during the daytime workdays, this rhythmic dialectics was and still is a vital element in São Paulo's downtown public streets and squares. There and then, the passerby is definitely not hegemonic. In the daytime, street society of São Paulo's historic downtown in the second decade of the 20th century, linear and cyclical repetitions seem to coexist in absolute indifference to the periodic disciplinary pressures of the public power and the police, which in the current context of economic globalization, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, fit into a specific political conception typical of so-called gentrification, the urban requalification of specific areas in cities, particularly the historically older urbanization nuclei for the purposes of tourism, housing, or consumption by higher income groups. In an attempt to explain the commercial and the useful, I quote Lefebvre, incisiveness of this conjunction of rhythms, Lefebvre offers an answer. Every rhythm implies the relation of a time to a space, a localized time, or if we prefer, a temporalized place. Rhythm is always connected to this or that place, to your place. End of quote. By mobilizing the anthropological and historical defamiliarization implicit in the regressive-progressive method, and hence by historically dating the body behavior pattern that I call the regular physical permanence in the downtown streets and squares of contemporary São Paulo during the daytime workdays, I was able to recognize its intriguing similarity with other modes of body behavior which prevailed during daytime in the streets and squares of the same area in a slavery-based 19th century São Paulo. The same holds true even though contemporary pedestrians are clearly very diverse, not to mention the social economic, the technical, the social cultural mediations that make it historically possible for such pedestrians to coexist socially in São Paulo's downtown streets and squares during the daytime. From the point of view of the body rhythm of the contemporary non-passerby, these same streets and places remain peculiarly close to that past, remembering and following Lefebvre that a place is a level of social space discernible through words of the everyday discourse, which in turn correspond to a certain use of a space, a spatial practice that such words say and compose. Based on these regressive-progressive rhythmanalytical findings, the temporal density of the body rhythms of non-passers-by suggests a process of urbanization that, at least at the level of the business and workday every day in the public places of downtown São Paulo, is strongly conditioned by pre-modern rhythms. In this light, at least during the daytime, the city mainly transforms itself, and so far as its historically central public places reproduces themselves day by day. And this in the midst of the periodic accumulation of supposedly innovative political, administrative, and urbanistic measures, which precisely go against the rules of body behavior that mediate the regular physical permanence of non-passers-by in such places. And now I'm finishing. Regardless of their differing theoretical and methodological standpoints, recent studies addressing how time interferes with the production of urban space end up pointing out the conceptual importance of empirically given both spatial and temporal practices in everyday life. It is through these practices that spatiality and temporality are produced, and hence also urban space. What is less emphasized is how the historical dimension of time, the entanglement between temporal categories that Western common sense names present, past, and future, manifests itself in these research practices, and hence in the production of urban space. Regressive-progressive rhythmanalysis hopes to be an appropriate methodological tool for tackling this issue. And hence I arrive at the three methodological contributions of my regressive-progressive rhythmanalysis for current rhythm analysis. The approach suggests, firstly, the cognitive importance of the anthropological and historical defamiliarization of the body rhythms of both the researcher and the surrounding human beings, when what matters is the analytical comprehension of the historical possibilities implicit in everyday life. In the particular case of pedestrians in urban public spaces, the defamiliarization I employed here allows the researcher to recognize their social cultural similarities with and differences from the surrounding pedestrians in the analyzed public spaces. The historical defamiliarization, in turn, it allows the researcher to acknowledge that at least some of their own and other body rhythms may be of another historical time and in the present. And obviously, I have to say that this approach, and that's why Lefebvre helps me a lot, is because I live in a country and in a city in which these historical layers all very strongly not only coexist in public places, but in the politics and so on and so on. But as we are seeing throughout the globe, this also possibly applies to other contexts as well. Hence, second contribution, regressive-progressive rhythmanalysis invites scholars to tackle a peculiar research object, the historicity of the rules of body behavior in the empirically researched spaces. Based on the aforementioned example, I would add that cities as forms of specific urban settlements are marked not only by the presence of spaces of passing by and of physical gatherings of pedestrians in crowds and so on, but also we have alternative historical temporalities that coexist within these patterns. And last but not least, in all, I would argue that to address the links between the daily and historical temporalities in Lefebvrean terms frees rhythm analytical interpretations from the socially eminently reproductive dynamics of the here and then of everyday life. We may flee neoliberal presentism, re-encounter history, and the critical possibilities and impossibilities of the current making of history. Thanks.